Hi, I'm Rick Reynolds, founder and president of Affair Recovery, and this is my story. It begins when I was 4 years old. I was sexually molested by some neighborhood kids. It was interesting in that particular situation. I didn't even know what we were doing was wrong. What caused the problem was my mom's reaction when I was severely punished after she caught me acting out with the other kids. Sadly, the message I took away from that wasn't one of guilt, but instead it was one of shame. The message of guilt is, I did something bad. The message of shame is, I am bad. And because of who I was, how I operated, I took that in as me being bad. It's one thing if your identity is someone that you feel good about yourself. What will occur then if something happens in life and you mess up, you don't see it as who you are. You see that you've made a mistake. You make a corrective action and take responsibility, and you go on. That's a healing sort of behavior. Guilt leads to healing. Shame, on the other hand, leads to hurt. And once I took that on as my identity, every time I did something bad, ultimately it reinforced the identity message. Growing up, we were in a very conservative, religious denomination, and it was all about appearances. My behaviors, however, continued to be shameful to me. Once I'd been sexualized, I continued to act out with other kids. And every time that happened, it reinforced the fact that there was something wrong with me. And even though I wanted to stop, I kept acting according to the way I saw myself. It's just who I was, and it was almost impossible to stop. What happened in the long run, because of my deep shame, is I became what I call a bad. I had a fear of being a disappointment. So I lived two lives. There was a part of me that was a pleaser. I did everything I could to get people to believe I was a good person, because deep down inside, I knew I was flawed. I knew there was something desperately wrong with me. But the problem with being a bad, having a fear of being a disappointment, is it makes you 100% totally self-centered. I remember when my daughter was in school at Belmont University, she had extreme performance anxiety, and we'd sent her to psychologists, vocal coaches, we'd gotten her on medication. None of those things were able to help her until right before her junior recital, when one of her professors ultimately said to her, right as she was going on stage, "You absolutely disgust me. You are one of the most self-centered, inconsiderate little divas I have ever met." Now, I'll tell you right now, my oldest daughter is probably one of the kindest, most considerate people you've ever met. However, she was also a bad. She had this fear of being a disappointment. And then a professor said to her, "You are always worried about what everybody's thinking about you." But here's the deal. If you're thinking about other people, and yet you're thinking about what they're thinking about you, you're still thinking about you. And that makes you completely self-centered. God's given you a message to deliver to those people, but instead of being concerned about whether or not you're giving people the message you've been given, you can only think about what they're thinking about you. And that makes you completely self-centered. Well, my problem was I was just like that. I was completely self-centered, living my dual life, always trying to please everyone, at the same time doing on the side what I wanted to do. By the time I met Stephanie, I was a full-blown sex addict. I'd never really been discovered. I had rules that I lived by, such as you never dig the latrine too close to the mess tent, so she had no idea that there was anything going on in my life. I was really sure, in fact, after we got married, and I came to that altar and said, "I will be faithful to you till death do us part," that I would be faithful to her. And I was for about 3 months. And then suddenly my old behaviors began to kick back in because I learned that what I had with Stephanie, which was, I think, appropriate marital relationships, was really different than the guilt and shame associated with my other acting out behaviors that I'd been involved with prior to marriage. So I picked those back up, and now all I had really done was added to my sexual repertoire. I had marital sex, and I had my old sexual behaviors, and I was now being unfaithful, grooming, emotional relationships, emotional affairs, pornography, many types of behaviors. I was able to keep everything hidden until 7 years into the marriage when I got involved with her best friend and my best friend's wife. Obviously, that broke rule number one, which was you never dig the latrine too close to the mess tent. And at first, I tried to stop this relationship, but I found, for me, it was absolutely impossible. That relationship, and in fact, my addiction, which I had yet to recognize, controlled my life. I didn't control it. I don't think it was until that point that I finally realized I had a serious problem. I tried several things to stop that affair. One of the things I did was spiritual disciplines. I thought maybe if I prayed enough, maybe if I fasted. In fact, I read a book by Richard Foster called Celebration of Disciplines, which talked about fasting. And I thought, well, I'm going to try fasting and see if that will stop my affair. As I begged to God, maybe I could do something like Gandhi, and go on a hunger strike, and God would set me free. An amazing thing did happen after my second long fast. I was definitely the skinniest adulterer in the city of Denver, Colorado, but I still couldn't break out of that relationship. And it was at that point I moved into full-blown despair. Honesty for me was not an option. And I realized if I couldn't stop this relationship, eventually this whole thing was going to come to light. I couldn't juggle it. It was too complex. The only solution, since honesty wasn't an option that I could come up with, is that somebody needed to die. I was full-blown suicidal. That was the only way anything would happen. I could die. I mean, if one of the other women died, I didn't want that. I'd prefer that it be me, but there was no way out of this triangle. We go on a church retreat. We're actually sharing a room with our friends, which, by the way, is awkward if you have your affair partner in a room with her husband and your wife. And it was a marriage retreat dealing with the covenant of marriage. We were in a lecture where the speaker was talking about that covenant, when suddenly I had a vision. Growing up in this conservative denomination, visions weren't something I actually even believed in. But at that moment, I left that room, and somehow I found myself in a movie theater. And there was a giant screen in front of me. On the right side of the screen, what was showing was the holiness of God. It was like this incredible light, and it was love, and it was just so intense and so bright. I could feel it literally passing through my body as if I were a wisp of smoke, and it just enveloped me. Now, on this side of the screen, what was showing was the holiness of Rick. And it was so black, literally, it was sucking light into it. And I was so arrogant, I actually yelled up over my shoulder to the projectionist, and I said, "Hey man, you've got the wrong picture up on the left." Because I'd always felt God was really fortunate to have me on his team. I know that may sound ridiculous as you watch this, but I was a worship leader. I was leading this huge class at our church. We had a Bible study in our home. Yeah, I know I had this little problem with my sexual addiction and my affair. However, God was still fortunate to have me on his team. And it was at that point that God spoke to me, and he just said this, "That's you." And guys, I looked back up on the left, and it was like scales fell from my eyes. It was my life in review. And suddenly I recognized all of those behaviors that I thought carried value, they meant nothing. Actually, nothing I had accomplished or I felt was important meant anything at all. And I was completely horrified. And then I moved from horror to terror because I asked myself, why in the world is God showing me this picture? And it suddenly dawned on me that this was judgment. And I just stroked out in that room upstairs. And I'd been judged, found wanting, and I was on my way down. And that terror just enveloped me. And at that point, I heard God scream at me, "And I love you." And I could just feel that incredible love from that light just surround me. It was as if this over here, it was there, but there wasn't judgment. He just loved me over and over. He just kept telling me and surrounding me with that love. And I was blown away. Because I'd always felt that if anybody ever saw me because of my shame, there's no way they could love me. I'd always felt I was completely unacceptable to God. When in reality, I suddenly discovered he was crazy about me. Not that he approved of this, but that's not what mattered to him. I'm what mattered. Over and over, "I love you." And suddenly, he sticks me back in this stupid conference room. And now I'm bawling. And through my tears, I just said, "What do you want from me? What do you want?" And I heard him speak, and he just said, "I want you to go tell your wife what you're doing, and I want you to tell your best friend that you're in an affair with his wife." And I said, "You've got to be kidding me." Because remember, honesty was the one thing that was not optional. So I actually went to the speaker afterwards, and I said, "Can I tell you a story?" And I did tell him about the affair. I didn't tell him about all the other ways I'd acted out for 7 years, but I certainly told him about what was relevant at that moment. And he asked me a question. His first question to me was this: "So what's God telling you?" And I said, "Well, it's funny you should ask, because he's telling me that ultimately I should go tell my wife and tell my best friend what's going on. But that doesn't make sense to me. Why should they be hurt because of what I've done?" And I remember him looking at me and going, "But Rick, if God says it, why does it need to make sense to you?" And I thought, that makes sense. And then he said, "What's the consequence of sin?" And I said, "Well, that would be death." He said, "Right. So anything they do short of killing you is really mercy, right?" And suddenly I realized I wasn't going to get what I deserved. All I had done up to that point was to try to manage and control everything, to protect myself. I'd never really been concerned about them. It had always been about me, and I used people to protect me, rather than just caring about other people and letting them make their own choices. The shame that I'd always felt was suddenly gone. I just realized if God could love me as I wasn't bad. He loved me. I just was what I was. I was his kid. I was loved of God. He then said, "Would you like some advice?" I said, "I am all over advice." And he said, "Don't ever be defensive. Just listen and keep remembering. Anything that happens to you, short of death, is going to be mercy." I know when I talk to people, when they come to counseling with me, the first question I always ask is, what's God telling you? Even people who are agnostic or atheist, I still ask the same question. Because often people know in their heart, or they've already heard from God what they need to be doing. But like me, they're just hoping someone will tell them something different. As you go through this process, I hope you'll also be asking yourself that question, what's God telling you? Back to the story. That night, I didn't tell Stephanie because we were still sharing the room with the other couple, and it felt strange to think about playing 20 questions with them in there. I did decide the next day when we left in the evening that I would tell Stephanie right as we were pulling out of the driveway when my wheels hit the pavement. So we're driving away, and I thought, this is the last moment of my life, because I knew what Stephanie would do. Stephanie is a very confident, not a shame-based person. Also very strong. I always joke that she's stronger than an acre of garlic. So as my wheels hit that pavement, I just said, I've got something to tell you. I'm having an affair with your best friend. She was absolutely blown away. I'd become so good at lying. She had seen some things with her friend that she thought were inappropriate, but she never imagined that I would do anything. In fact, she believed that she would be far more likely to be unfaithful in our relationship than me. That's how high a view she held me in. And the one thing I'd heard God clearly tell me is just be honest. Be honest. And so I told her the story. And as she asked questions, I answered all of her questions, and I began to try to tell her everything in my life. I wanted her to really know me. I no longer wanted to control her by the flow of information. I just wanted to be honest. Part of the problem was I had done so much that I kept remembering things I had forgotten. I learned that it didn't help if I said that's everything, that there was a good chance something else would come to mind. And so I finally said that's all I remember up to this point. And then when something else would come up in my mind, I would actually say there is no way I'm going to tell her that. And then I'd begin throwing up. And I'd finally go, okay, I'll tell her. So then I would go and tell her that thing. It was interesting, just the fact that I went to her on my own and gave her information without her asking was one of the things that gave her hope. One of the most important things I told Stephanie as we were going through that discovery phase, I believe I even told her this on the very first night, is I was not going to try to save our marriage. It's not that my marriage wasn't important to me. I love Stephanie. I didn't want to lose the marriage, but I also realized if saving the marriage was my primary goal, it wasn't going to be pragmatically smart for me to be honest with her. Why in the world would I tell her something that I knew that ultimately would cause her to not want to be with me? I'd always been a bad. I always had a fear of being a disappointment. And for once, I had to be willing to take the risk, to expose my shame, to share the parts of me I felt that were completely unacceptable, that were a disappointment. I had for once I had to become someone who could be real, could be authentic, rather than always hiding behind my image. I told Stephanie I hoped I'd become somebody that she'd like to be with, but I wasn't even sure who that person was because I'd always compromised myself for her and everybody else, and it was time for me to be real with God. I told her the only thing that was important to me ultimately was to be right with God and do what I felt God was telling me to do, not to please her and to compromise God. Probably that's the one thing that ultimately saved our marriage. I think if I'd gone back trying to please her, if I'd been the way I'd always been before, If it had been about her and me trying to manipulate or control her, I think she would have left me. But the one thing she began to see was my passion to be real, to be authentic, to follow God. That gave her hope. And I would recommend in your own recovery, those of you who have been unfaithful, to make something else your goal rather than trying to please your mate. The only way to deal with shame, ultimately, is to expose it. It's to be responsible. Before, I could take responsibility for what I was doing, but that created no change. When I began to be responsible, to be authentic, to be real, to truly share my feelings, my opinions, what I'd done in life, when I could be responsible to do that, I began to be free. And then it became more about guilt, and I could see the places where I had messed up, but it was about behavior at that point. It wasn't that I was bad. It's that I had made a mistake. I had done something bad, and everything changed at that point. I began to become a different person. It was also at that stage that I got my first piece of bad advice. One of the people I'd always been most afraid of disappointing had been my own father. I loved my dad, but he was a very strong individual, and we all had to compromise ourselves because of his anger to be what he wanted. And because of that, it was that behavior, that system that also had added to my shame. In fact, I can even think of times that I felt God was telling me to do something, and I told God no because I didn't even want to disappoint my own father. So the first person that Stephanie called after she discovered everything was my mom. That may be a bad piece of advice for the rest of you, calling your mate's parents if you've been the one who's hurt, so I'm not giving that as advice. My dad was really crushed because he'd always thought I was this outstanding son because of my behavior. Little did he know who I truly was. We got on the phone when I called him and I said, "Dad, I've got some things to tell you. I am no longer going to do what you want. I'm no longer going to live for you. For once in my life, I'm going to become who I think I really am and who God wants me to be." His bad advice at that point was, you better be listening to what I'm telling you. More than that, you need to just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can do this. Don't be so radical in your recovery. You can handle this. And he was telling me, in a sense, just go back to pretending. Go back to being the way I was, that it had worked before and it'd work again. And I told him at that point, there's no way. I'd even told God at that point that if I go back to being that for bad, I hoped he would take my life. I never wanted to be inauthentic again. I wanted to be ultimately who I was. One of the serendipitous things I learned through the process of being totally authentic with Stephanie, however, was that you can never be loved unconditionally as long as you only conditionally let someone know who you are. I had always believed Stephanie's love was conditional. I'd never recognized that I'd never trusted her with the information. By believing she was conditional, I didn't have to be authentic. But once I finally took the risk to be authentic with her, when she continued to love me, that was probably the first time, other than in my vision, when God loved me, that I was truly loved unconditionally. Probably one of the most amazing things that had ever occurred in my life, for sure. Stephanie was desperate to find something to hang on to. After I'd told her everything I'd done for those years, she'd never heard of anybody as jacked up as I was. And she was at a total loss. We lost our entire community since I'd had an affair with her best friend, our small group, our circle of friends. Everybody had been affected by what I did. The social shame for her was incredible. While I was getting free and feeling better about myself than I had ever felt, where I was getting my feet underneath me, Stephanie was literally destroyed. Her whole identity, her life, she no longer trusted her past. She certainly didn't trust me. She couldn't trust her present. She didn't know what was going on. She didn't trust herself because I'd deceived her. She didn't know what her future was. Everything about Stephanie had been destroyed because of what I'd done. She went to a bookstore to buy a book, anything that would be a resource. She found one book called The Myth of the Greener Grass by Alan Peterson. There was one chapter in that book, it was called The Anatomy of an Affair, that I just underlined that chapter because the man's story in that chapter was just like mine. Since Stephanie thought I was a freak, I wanted her to read that chapter. So I was just going, look, I'm not the only one that's like this. Not that I believe that helped her that much, but at least I felt better knowing I wasn't the only one. At the time all of this was happening, I was actually training to be a marriage and family therapist. That to me just, I guess, exposes the level of hypocrisy that I was living with. I mean, what type of fraud I really was. Instead of being a marriage saver, I was a home wrecker. Even knowing therapists in the community didn't help. We went to several therapists. They had no idea what to do with us or how to help us. The only thing they could say is either try to stay together or you need to get away from him. We couldn't find anybody that had answers. In those days, there wasn't anything like the Emergency Marital Seminar, or the Weekend, or the EMS online. Those resources didn't exist. We could just find one single book. So we went to a spiritual renewal conference in Nashville, Tennessee. We drove over from Denver to Nashville to hear a speaker that the man I had actually told the story to, who had been a mentor of mine, said he thought would be helpful. When we were there, he told me, I think you ought to talk to the conference leader because I think he's got a story similar to yours. I said, you think or you know? He said, well, I think, I don't know for certain. And I said, you want me to go up to a guy at this conference with over 1,500 people and tell him we've got something in common that, you know, I cheated on my wife. Now, Stephanie actually thought this was a great idea. So I finally told her, look, if I see this guy alone, I'll talk to him. But I'm not going to embarrass myself in front of a bunch of people, which, by the way, in retrospect, that was a little bit selfish. I should have been thinking about her rather than my own personal embarrassment. I wish I'd done that one different. We skipped one of the sessions and went outside. We're on the Belmont campus in Nashville, and there the speaker was, a guy named Jamie Buckingham with his wife, Jackie, sitting in a gazebo all by themselves. Nobody else in sight on an entire university campus. And I went, whoa, that's a coincidence. So Stephanie grabs my hand and drags me straight over there. We sit down in front of Jamie and Jackie. And I said, I think we might have something in common. I'm not sure, but I cheated on my wife. And Jamie, he looked at me and said, well, I did the same. I'm kind of thinking, thank God, you know. And he said, what have you guys been doing? And we told him about our failed attempts at counseling. We told him about finding Peterson's book, The Myth of the Greener Grass. And I said, in fact, in that book, The Myth of the Greener Grass, there's a chapter called The Anatomy of an Affair. And I said, man, that guy is just like me. And he said, yeah, that's me. And I said, yeah, that's me. And he said, no, Rick, hang on. That's my story. Peterson came and interviewed me. Literally, that's my story. And I thought, whoa, what are the odds of me meeting someone whose story I related to in Tennessee when he had come from Florida and I'd come from Denver? How could I meet someone like that? And that was probably one of the first times that Stephanie had hope. She turned to Jackie and she said, "Why in the world would you stay with him? Why?" And Jackie said, "Steph, I had 4 kids. I knew he was a good man. I didn't know where to go. And I thought, I'm just going to give it a shot. I'm just going to try and see what happens." She said, "I am so glad ultimately that I did." It was meeting Jamie and Jackie that ultimately began our journey. That's where we learned that healed individuals are vital guides, one of the primary principles at Affair Recovery. We learned that having those who had already been there, who could share their stories, that could show the way through, was critical. Otherwise, in the midst of all of that pain and turmoil, it's difficult to see how there could be any hope unless you begin to see those types of stories where it had happened. That's the point when we began to learn that community serves as a catalyst for healing. Another one of the primary beliefs at Affair Recovery, because as people began to come around us after we met Jamie and Jackie, we had others we were sharing with. It was like it began to normalize a little bit of what we were going through. Up to that point, we had felt like total freaks. We knew there was nobody else like us, but when we could suddenly talk to others, we began to see new ways of being. We had been limited by our own thinking. We didn't see other possibilities. One of my favorite quotes from Einstein is, "No problem can be solved by the same consciousness that created it." And Stephanie and I were stuck in the same type of thinking that had brought us exactly to that place. But as that community began to play out in our lives, we began to find other ways of being. It was during that stage where we had seen other people get through this, is where we learned that every life can be restored. I don't know saying that every marriage can be restored, but we had seen time and time again how people had recovered. More than that, the best marriages we had ever witnessed were the marriages that had gone through this, because they understood something of life. They understood something of the importance and the value of what they had. They were so intentional in life, and ultimately, that gave us something we wanted to strive for. We looked to the future and we went, wow, we want what those people have. People treated me with such love. They didn't judge me. And that's where we learned that unconditional dignity and respect are essential. I know when people come to Affair Recovery, one of their fears, especially if they've been unfaithful, is that they're going to be judged. They're going to be put down ultimately for what they've done. Like me, I think many of us who've been unfaithful, we have such deep cores of shame. And we've always known that if anybody really knows who we are and what we've done, they'll do nothing but judge us and put us down and continue to shame us. But when people began to treat me with dignity and respect, even as Stephanie began to treat me ultimately with that, but before Stephanie could do it, there were others, and that helped me see that I wasn't bad. I began to deal with my behavior instead of staying with the shame, which was always hurting me and hurting other people. It was during that stage, as we watched the other couples, where we learned that crisis, severe crisis, leads to radical transformation. I don't think Stephanie and I could have ever changed apart from that crisis. We were in such a rut. And as we watched couples go through this, as we've gone through this, we've learned that we all need a catalyst for change. And this served as our catalyst to break us out of who we once had been and help us become someone new, creating a relationship that was fresh and exciting and ultimately alive. I would never wish this on anybody. I don't want anybody to go through this type of pain. It is horrendous. Infidelity produces a pain like no other. At the same time, there's hope. And this is an event that can set you free if you choose to use it. It really can serve as that catalyst to take you to a new place in life. Instead of looking at the failure as a problem, we began to see that failure teaches what success cannot. Again, had it not been for my failure and beginning to be responsible in dealing with that, we would have never broken out of all of this. We also learned through all of this, the pain of infidelity can be healed. Pain that's not transformed is going to be transmitted. Untransformed shame keeps you forever tied to the pain. It was the lessons we learned dealing with those other couples where we saw how to transform that pain, how to transform that shame, so that we no longer lived in the cesspool of life that I guess we had been destined to for 7 years. It's now been 31 years since my discovery. In fact, next month it will be 32 years. I can tell you that it's been an amazing 32 years. It's even prepared us for so many things in life that I don't think we could have ever gone through as a partnership without having first passed through this. I love my life, and I love my wife. I can't imagine what our marriage would have been like if we had stayed stuck in that same routine. I think probably we would have continued going farther and farther apart until after the kids left, we probably would have just split up. We would have never learned to love each other. I would have never learned to be honest. Our relationship would have been completely boring. Now we have an alive marriage. As weird as this sounds, our mission at Affair Recovery is to help those who've been impacted by infidelity find extraordinary lives of meaning and purpose. Again, to use this as a catalyst to help you get to another place. Those are the lessons Steph and I learned from our friends, from our community, from the vital guides, from those that had already been healed. That's what they helped us find. And in the long run, that's what we would like to help you guys discover. Obviously, at the point we met Jamie and Jackie, and at the point we came into a community where we began to walk along beside others who continue to encourage us, as we also encourage them, that wasn't the end of the journey. We found at Affair Recovery through our research that it's going to take as long as 18 to 24 months to get to the other side of this. Not that it's bad. Please don't freak out when I say that. Not that it's bad for 18 to 24 months. But the triggers that come as a result of my actions continue to rock our lives for a long time. I always say, if you take a rock and throw it into a pond, when it hits the water, all of these ripples begin to come out from the impact of that rock. Infidelity is much like that. The actions that I had taken and the trauma I created caused ongoing ripples to pass through our life for 18 to 24 months. Even though Steph and I were great in terms of our marriage, she was still impacted by the consequences of what I'd done for that time period. But eventually those things passed. At Affair Recovery, we've learned that it's not time that heals all wounds. It's how you spend the time that helps you begin to heal. There are couples who've been dealing with their infidelity, stuck, rotating around that for 10, 17, 20 years because no one was able to tell them what to do. We want to give you direction so that doesn't happen to you. It's probably hard to imagine that at 2 years, you're not rocked by anniversary dates or triggers anymore. It's even more difficult when you're at this stage at 3 years to think that these things rarely come to mind. To think at 5 years, you can laugh at all of these things. In fact, Stephanie, at 25 years, was told a story by a friend, someone else who was going through a difficult situation, and Stephanie's first response to that person was, "I can't imagine what that would feel like." And her friend said, "Well, of course you can imagine." And she went, "Oh yeah." Can you believe that there's the possibility you can come to a place at 25 years where you can't even remember what happened? But we're not the only ones that have experienced that. A common mistake made by marriage therapists is focusing on the problem or a problem in the marriage, trying to explain ultimately why the infidelity happened. They take a cause and effect approach. In reality, this approach leads to blaming the hurt spouse. At that point, it becomes the marriage that's the problem, it becomes the hurt spouse that's the problem. It doesn't allow the unfaithful spouse to look at themselves and begin to take responsibility or be responsible for their part. We've learned that for a marriage to heal, you first have to heal the boundary in that relationship. This relationship between husband and wife has to be rejoined. There has to be healing there before you can begin to work on the problems in the marriage. It has to be sequential. You can't do both at the same time. For those of you who have been unfaithful, you may hear me say this and go, "Oh my word, are we not going to look at the problems in the relationship?" Absolutely. Remember, this is a catalyst that takes you to another place. But until there's safety reestablished in the relationship and the boundaries reestablished in the relationship, there's no way to focus on those other problems. You first have to heal this, and then we do move on to that so that you can have the marriage you've always wanted. When the marital bond is broken, there really isn't a marriage to begin to work on. First, that attachment, that bond has to be reestablished so that you can begin to look at this relationship. At Affair Recovery, we do work at trying to heal the marriage, but we know this attachment has to reoccur, that it has to be healing, a rebonding, before we'll deal with these other things. That doesn't take a long time, but it is going to be essential to healing and to future growth. Only 13% of couples in Peggy Vaughn's research reported that their therapist knew how to deal with the infidelity. I can tell you that Affair Recovery, because of community, over 90% of our couples report that this is very helpful. I do know it's a great path for healing. I hope at least you'll look at the program and begin to see that it's something that can work for you and give you the support that you need and the hope that you need to begin to move forward. Whether or not you use the services at Affair Recovery, I want to strongly encourage you to find somebody who specializes in infidelity. People always think they know what they would do if they were in your situation. But as you've already learned, no one knows how they're going to respond till they get to this particular place. In fact, you probably don't even know what you're going to do yet, at least though you're considering that there may be something that's worth salvaging, but you don't know yet. But talking to people who haven't gone through this, if you don't have people who have survived and done well, therapists who specialize or pastors who specialize in this and understand the complexities, you're going to get some bad advice. I've had people told that they need to be having more sex with their mate, or they need to lose a little bit of weight, or they need to do a better job of keeping the house clean, or they need to make sure they never tell anybody about all of this, that ultimately your mate's never going to be able to trust you again. So you need to just get out of this thing, or they're never going to be able to forgive you. Or why would you be honest with your mate? Why should they be hurt? Ultimately because of what you've done. That if you've fallen out of love with them, there's no way you can ever fall back in love with them. All of those things and many more messages are wrong. They're myths. They're not true. I know they may feel true in the moment, but I can promise you they're not true. I hope as you go through this process that the lies you believe will be exposed, that you can find new truth. We hope for you that this horrible event, this thing that I'm sure is the worst thing that you've ever experienced, will be able to help you find, as strange as it may sound, a new life, an extraordinary life of meaning and purpose.